Health Secretary Wes Streeting is pushing ahead with the puberty blocker trial despite all the calls to stop it in its tracks. I'm Connie Shaw, this is GB News Originals, and I'm joined by James Esses, a psychotherapist and founder of Just Therapy, who has been and continues to be at the forefront of the campaign to stop this trial. James, first of all, the big question that's put to those such as yourself who wish to stop this trial is that this trial was the recommendation of the CAS review in order to find out whether the puberty blocker drugs were safe and effective. And the review was welcomed by many people who wanted to stop puberty blockers in the first place. And it was clear that the review was to assess whether we had enough evidence to be using these drugs safely, and Hilary Cass said that we didn't. So surely it's best that we do this trial to obtain the evidence that's needed.
Well, look, the CAS review was extremely important, right? It shone a spotlight on what had been going on in the Tavistock and the scandals there, and it cemented the complete lack of evidence that we've got for medical transitioning. But I and others are increasingly concerned by the narrative being put out by Dr. Cass and others in support of this trial.
One of the things that Hilary Cass said recently to Hannah Barnes at the New Statement, she said that, and I quote, "I didn't even necessarily anticipate whether or not such a trial would get through an ethics committee or whether a group of academics would be able to even design a trial given the circumstances that we're now in." She then went on to say, "I didn't prejudge whether it would happen, and if the ethics committee had said, despite everything, we don't think this is an ethical approach, then I would have been content with that too." Is her almost indifference to the prospect of this trial something to be concerned about? Because you alluded to that very aspect just now.
It is concerning because we already know from past studies, and some of these were cited in the CAS report, that there are concerns around damage to brain development, bone growth, sexual functioning. And we know that puberty blockers can act as a slippery slope towards infertility if children go on to take cross-sex hormones. And the majority of them end up doing that exactly. So yes, the indifference is concerning. We've seen much the same from Wes Streeting himself. He's essentially been talking out of both sides of his mouth. He's kind of trying to back both horses. I mean, he spoke to an LGBT event that I sent someone undercover to record last September. And at that event, he said that when he first banned puberty blockers, he said that decision made him very uncomfortable. And then just 2 months later, speaking on LBC about the agreement to give the trial a go-ahead, he said that trialing puberty blockers made him very uncomfortable. So which way is it, Wes? Myself and my legal team, and we're on the cusp of starting our judicial review to block the government's path on this. That may have already occurred by the time this piece is put out. But we try to engage with the ethical bodies responsible for overseeing and approving the trial. And to be honest, Connie, there's been a conspiracy of silence. There's been a complete and utter lack of transparency, refusal to engage with us, to disclose documents around protocols and the ethical assessment behind the trial itself. Some of the justification they used for not disclosing these ethical documents to us was on the basis of quote unquote commercial considerations. Now, given that we're talking about the welfare of some of the most vulnerable children in society, surely commerce should not come into it. So we're concerned, and we don't believe that it's been correctly, ethically approved. And actually, if you saw the decision that was finally published online, which gave the green light to the trial, there were simply 4 words in the box that was there to detail the justification for why the trial had been approved in the first place. So there's a complete and utter lack of proper rigor when it comes to this trial.
Do you think there's a way that this trial could be ethical? Is there a way that they could carry out a trial to find the evidence that they want to obtain that would be ethical?
No, I don't, because you have to look at what should the prerequisites be for a clinical trial. So again, firstly, there needs to be proper rigor. There should be a control group when it comes to clinical trials. A control group in this instance is impossible given the nature of puberty blockers, and so there isn't one. The follow-up period that we can see is only 2 years, whereas we know that the harm may take many years, even decades, to present itself. Using clinical trials, particularly on children, should be an absolute last resort. Ethics requires you to trial out the least invasive and least risky option first. So, for example, there should have been a standalone trial on whether psychotherapy alone can alleviate feelings of gender dysphoria. There needs to be further exploration of animal-based trials as well before moving on to children. Most concerning of all is the fact that we already know that thousands of children were put on this pathway in the United Kingdom, and we don't have the data for it. And there is an imperative to engage in proper data linking. It's simply not sufficient for the government to turn around now and say, well, we don't have that data, so let's just wrangle up a few hundred extra children.
Obviously, there will be trans activists in particular who say that it's not true, that there's no evidence, that actually giving puberty blockers to children is a life-saving treatment. What would you say back to that, and how do you dismantle those kinds of arguments?
Well, we've already had the assertions of suicidality debunked. This notion that if you don't give a child puberty blockers, they're going to go and kill themselves. That's simply not the case. And we've seen that in a government commissioned report on suicide in this space. I have had the misfortune of having to engage with significant numbers of detransitioners who have been left infertile and irreversibly mutilated off the back of medical transitioning. And so I've seen firsthand the harm that can be caused in the name of this so-called medication. I work with children week in and week out in my therapy practice who say that they're transgender and they want to transition. And crucially, when I'm assessing a child's holistic well-being, I don't do this based on feelings alone, right? So a child with an eating disorder, they might claim to feel better when they're at their absolute skinniest, but that doesn't mean that they're well or that this is in their best interest. In fact, often quite the opposite. And so children may indeed report feeling happier on puberty blockers. They frequently do. That doesn't mean it's not causing them serious harm.
You mentioned earlier about Wes Streeting, about how he says one thing to one group of people and another thing to another. One thing that has always confused me about the whole ideology of transgenderism is that I understand that trans groups have a lot of power in their lobbying. But why do you think that politicians who, like Wes Streeting, I think, who has he said the words, I've taken it on the chin, about things that he may have got wrong in the past over this particular issue. But what is it that is really pressuring politicians? Because yes, there might be powerful lobby groups that have trans ideology that they want to push. But when it comes to the general public, most people, when you look at the polling, do not believe that people can actually change sex, or that men who say they're women should be able to go into women's changing rooms. So what is it? Why is it that politicians are so nervous around this topic? Is it that they're scared about giving ammunition to the Green Party, for example? But it's only been within the last year or so that the Green Party has had more of a resurgence in its popularity, but this issue has been going on for so long. Do you have any theory? Because I don't, and I really don't understand this part of it. Why are politicians so scared about talking about this?
Well, in the case of Wes Streeting, he was a former employee of Stonewall, so I don't think we should be completely surprised by the way that he's carrying on with this. In general, I think politicians want to do whatever is most expedient to them. They like to play the field. They rely on public support, and this issue is extremely divisive and contentious. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a clear majority against, for example, medicalizing children or allowing men into women's spaces, because we know from polling that there is. So that's the shame of it, actually, because the majority of the public would be on politicians' side if they stood up for justice and what was right in the name of children and women. But as you've alluded to, there is a very, very vocal minority of these trans activists. They still carry a lot of clout. There's a lot of organizations, public and private, that still kowtow to them, Stonewall's various rating and review schemes and gold stars for employers. And a lot of them have become so reliant upon this. So I think they still wield a lot of power. They can also be a pretty nasty bunch, if I'm honest, and they can get quite violent and nasty. And I've spoken to politicians who have stood up and spoken out against, for example, puberty blockers, and they've received significant threats from some of these individuals. I myself am in receipt of frequent threats to my safety because I've stood out and spoken up about it. So I think there is some fear there. I think it also gets caught up in this notion these days of, hashtag be kind. And all of that. And because gender identity is now associated with who a person is on the inside, rather than it being seen as a kind of mental health provision, which is what I consider it to be, there is this assumption amongst many, well, live and let live. But that's a very naive point of view, because when you give one group of people rights, you can end up significantly detracting from the rights of others. And we've seen that in the context of women's spaces, etc. So I think part of it is wanting to just get by and get ahead and get votes, I think, and not want to rock the boat. I think part of it is out of fear. I mean, some of these people are also just out and out ideologues. I mean, when I listen to some of the MPs from Liberal Democrats or Greens speak on this issue, I mean, it really does send a chill down my spine.
Mm. You mentioned earlier about the judicial review that you're bringing against the government, and that is in collaboration with Kira Bell, as far as I understand, one of the most prominent detransitioners in our country. Yes. Could you give an update on what's happening with that and how that might affect what happens with the trial? Because I think that, even I still struggle to understand what a judicial review necessarily is, how that might affect the government, the idea that activists can just sort of, take legal action against a government that are doing something that they disagree with. How does that work?
Well, look, bringing a judicial review isn't easy, and there's quite a high bar in order to bring it, and it's also very expensive. And this has been in the works now ever since this trial was first announced. And we have tried to work with the government outside of a legal framework. As I said, we've been speaking and sending letters back and forth for many months, trying to engage collaboratively with them, and they've essentially refused to engage with us. And in fact, when you send through a pre-action letter, which is a prerequisite to a judicial review, one of the things you can consider is whether you would be open to, alternative dispute resolution, like a form of mediation outside of court. And we said to the relevant bodies that we were open to that, and they essentially said that they weren't. So where are we left with but to take this all the way? I also started a government petition a few weeks ago, calling for a halt to the trial. That received 137,000 signatures in just 72 hours. That's one of the fastest growing petitions of all time in this country. The government responded yesterday to that, and they essentially ignored the petition and the public outcry, and they said they're cracking on regardless. So we've tried other means. This is where we've been left, and if they're not going to stop the trial voluntarily, then we're going to force them to do it. I think by the time this piece goes out, the judicial review will have been formally commenced. At that point, we're just waiting to send off the final letters as we speak. And then it's a case of waiting for a hearing date at the High Court. We're bringing the judicial review on the basis that the trial itself is both unlawful and irrational. Those are the tests that apply when it comes to judicial reviews. We've got a number of expert witnesses, and we think we've got a very strong case. But the recruitment for this trial was meant to start a few weeks ago. We've been told that is now being pushed back by a number of weeks in response to our judicial review. But it could take months potentially for us to be seen in the High Court. And so if we need to, we will also try and seek an emergency injunction to make sure that not a single child is enrolled onto this trial.
Mm. We've also just had the news about a case in New York where a detransitioner has won $2 million after taking the doctors who carried out a double mastectomy on her, I think at the age of 16. What implications will this have in the UK, do you think?
Well, look, the US is a very different system to us when it comes to personal injury and other tort-like claims. But it is very interesting. I mean, I was very pleased to see it. And that's what should be happening. Children, young adults who have been encouraged and affirmed down this pathway and irreversibly harmed as a result, they should be compensated for that. So I certainly hope that makes its way over to the United Kingdom.
And James, finally, why do you in particular feel so strongly about this? Because it's a very niche topic for a lot of people. I mean, I don't consider it a niche topic. But for the wider public, people often wonder why people choose these fights. How was it that you ended up fighting this one?
From a young age, I've cared about child safeguarding. It's why I started to volunteer in that space. It's why I made the decision to leave my role as a lawyer and civil servant to become a psychotherapist. I care about people, particularly children. And when I first read about this a number of years ago, and I was pretty late to the party. I mean, there were other people out there who had been campaigning on this for years. I just couldn't believe this was actually happening, using taxpayers' money to sterilise and mutilate children. And when I used to volunteer at Childline, I had young children coming through to me, very young children, saying that they were trapped in the wrong body and they hated themselves and they wanted to block their puberty and have their genitals removed. I couldn't quite believe how dystopian this was. There's a lot going on in the world and in British society at the moment, but as far as I'm concerned, one of a state's primary roles is to protect its citizens, and adults in a state, their primary role is to protect its children. And if we're not protecting our most vulnerable children, if we're actively harming them, then I think that's an awful world to live in. And so for me, above all else, this is the issue of our time. And it touches everyone, right? Because we've all got children or siblings. We've all got women and girls in our lives who have also unfortunately fallen victim to this nefarious gender ideology. So I believe that every single one of us have skin in this game because children are worth more than anything to us as a society.
James, where can people find your work?
Well, I increasingly live on social media, so you can see regular updates on my campaigning in general and the judicial review on my X profile. I've got a Substack as well where I write on these issues. And, you know, this has been covered by the mainstream media. It was in the BBC a few weeks ago when we first brought out the pre-action letter. This is going to be a very big case. This is going to have not just national, but international ramifications. And we've said that if necessary, and we've got the funding in place, we're going to take this all the way to the Supreme Court because the stakes are far too high.
James, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching. I'm Connie Shaw. This is GB News Originals. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more interviews about extremely important topics like this.